3 days after my father died, I walked into my kitchen and found my husband sitting at the table in sweatpants, drinking coffee like he had nowhere else to be. At first, I thought he had taken a few days off to grieve with me. Then I noticed his company laptop was closed, his work phone was missing, and there was something strangely relaxed about his expression. "Why are you home?" I asked. He looked up and gave me a small smile. "I quit." I actually thought I had misheard him. My father had been dead for 72 hours. His funeral was still 2 days away. Sympathy cards covered our dining table. My father's last voicemail was still saved on my phone, and I hadn't even chosen which suit he would be buried in. Yet my husband had apparently decided his working life was over. When I asked why, he took another sip of coffee and said the sentence that changed the way I looked at our 22-year marriage forever. "Because we don't need my salary anymore." Your father left you enough. For 22 years, I had believed my husband and I were building the same life. We had shared mortgage payments, vacations, arguments over whose turn it was to buy groceries, and the 1,000 tiny compromises that make a marriage feel permanent. My name was Claire Bennett, and until that week, I never thought of my father's money as anything other than my father's money. My husband, Mark, apparently had a very different understanding. He had already calculated what my inheritance could mean for his future, and the terrifying part was that he hadn't started calculating after my father died. He had started months before. I just didn't know it yet. And before this story was over, I would discover a document my father had secretly created almost a year before his death, a document that proved he had noticed something about my husband that I had spent years refusing to see. My father, Walter Hale, was not the kind of man who talked about money. He owned a commercial HVAC company for most of his adult life and eventually sold it for several $1,000,000, but you would never have guessed it from the way he lived. He drove the same truck until the doors started making noises. He complained when a restaurant charged an extra $2 for coffee. He had 4 tape measures because he didn't trust the one in his garage. My mother had died several years earlier, and after that, Dad became quieter, but he remained stubbornly independent. He never told me exactly how much he had invested, and I never asked. We talked about my work, his garden, my daughter Emily, and whether the Cleveland Browns would ever stop disappointing him. Money almost never came up. So when Mark told me my inheritance was enough for both of us, my first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. "How do you know how much I'm getting?" I asked. Mark hesitated for just long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then he said, "Claire, come on. Your dad sold the company. His house is paid off. He had investments. Even conservatively, you're probably getting a few million." Conservatively. That word stayed with me. You don't say conservatively unless you've already done the math. That evening, Mark's mother Diane and his sister Melissa came over with food. Normally, I would have appreciated the gesture. Instead, I sat at the table watching something unfold that made me feel like I had accidentally walked into a meeting about a company I didn't know I owned. Diane complained about her rent going up again, and Mark immediately told her she wouldn't have to worry much longer. "Once the estate clears, I'll get you a place," he said. Diane's face brightened. Melissa laughed and said, "Mom already has her new neighborhood picked out." Mark laughed too, then turned toward his sister and casually offered her $200,000 to clear her business debt. I lowered my fork and stared at him. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had asked what Dad had left, what I wanted, or whether I even planned to give anybody money. They were already spending it. When I finally said, "Dad hasn't even been buried," the entire table became uncomfortable. Mark looked at me as though I had interrupted something important. "We're family," he said. "We're finally in a position to help people." I answered quietly, "You are promising people money that isn't yours." That night, after his family left, Mark followed me into the kitchen and accused me of embarrassing his mother. I asked him what gave him the right to promise her a house. He said we were married, so there was no such thing as his money and my money. I remember standing there with my hands wet from washing dishes and realizing how strange that sounded. During 22 years of marriage, we had always shared household expenses. But sharing a life wasn't the same thing as owning every asset the other person received. I told him that. He shook his head and said I was turning grief into a financial argument. Maybe he thought that would end the conversation. Instead, it gave me the first question I couldn't stop asking. If this was just about helping his family, why had he been so certain about my inheritance before I even knew what it was? The answer came the next morning when my father's attorney called. His name was Samuel Green, and Dad had trusted him for years. Samuel offered his condolences and then asked me to come to his office. I said Mark could come with me, but Samuel paused before answering. "Your father specifically requested that our first meeting be with you alone." I remember staring at the wall after the call ended. Why would Dad have made that request? He knew Mark. They had spent holidays together, birthdays together, and countless family dinners together. Dad had never openly accused my husband of anything, but Samuel's tone made me wonder whether there was something my father had wanted to tell me before he died. When I arrived at Samuel's office, he didn't begin with the inheritance amount. Instead, he asked me a question. "Did Mark ever tell you that he came to see your father without you?" I shook my head. Samuel opened a folder and explained that Mark had contacted Dad several times during the previous year. There had been a visit, a phone conversation, and an email exchange. According to Samuel, Mark had started by talking about how exhausted he was at work. That wasn't unusual. Mark had complained about his job for years, but eventually the conversation had shifted toward retirement. Mark had apparently told my father that once I inherited the estate, he could finally stop working. Dad had asked him what he meant. Mark had laughed and said, "We're married, Walter. What she inherits affects both of us." Samuel then handed me a handwritten page my father had authorized him to release after his death. I recognized Dad's handwriting immediately. He had written down the conversation because something about it bothered him. I read the page twice. My father had written that Mark wasn't threatening him, wasn't demanding money, and technically hadn't done anything illegal. But Dad had noticed that Mark was talking about my future inheritance as if it were already his retirement plan. Then I reached one sentence that made my eyes burn. Dad had written, "I don't want to leave Claire my opinion of her husband along with my money. I want her to make that decision herself." That was my father. Even in death, he wasn't telling me who to trust. He was giving me enough information to decide for myself. Samuel then told me something that made my hands go cold. Dad's estate was worth approximately $3.8 million, plus the family home and several other assets. But most of the inheritance had been placed into a trust. For the first several years, large distributions would require approval from an independent trustee. A gift to another person, a major investment, or a large transfer could be restricted. Dad had created a financial barrier around the inheritance. And suddenly, Mark's decision to quit his job 3 days after Dad's death looked very different. When I returned home, Mark was waiting. His first question wasn't whether I was okay. It was, "How much did Samuel say?" I stared at him. He immediately changed the question to, "What are the terms of the trust?" I told him only that Dad had placed restrictions on large distributions. Mark's face changed. "So we can't use our own money?" he asked. I corrected him. "It's my inheritance." His jaw tightened. "Seriously, that's how we're going to talk now?" I didn't answer. That night, I woke sometime after 1 in the morning and heard Mark speaking quietly on his phone downstairs. I stopped on the staircase when I heard him say, "Don't panic, the money exists, it's just tied up." There was a pause, then he said, "Claire will come around." I didn't walk into the room. I went back upstairs. For the first time in our marriage, I decided I didn't need to confront him immediately. I needed to know what he said when he believed I wasn't listening. The next morning, I asked him directly what he had promised people. He initially denied there was anything else. Then, under pressure, he admitted he had already been planning a lake house. He had contacted a realtor and put down a refundable deposit using our joint account. He had told Diane she could stop worrying about her rent. He had told Melissa she could settle her debt. He had even been thinking about spending part of the winter somewhere warm. It wasn't one impulsive decision. It was an entire future. A future he had designed without me. When I asked when he had started planning it, he said he'd only recently begun thinking seriously about retirement. I didn't believe him, so I called Samuel again. Samuel had another file. This time, he didn't hesitate. He told me my father had authorized the release of several documents after his death. The first was an investment proposal Mark had apparently created. The title at the top was Hale Bennett Family Financial Plan. I almost laughed when I saw it because the name made it sound like Mark had been appointed chief executive of my inheritance. Then I started reading. There were projected investment returns, a lake property, housing assistance for Diane, debt repayment for Melissa, and a retirement projection for Mark. The document contained estimates of my inheritance in multiple places. It referred to Claire's expected inheritance, Claire's assets, and Claire's projected investment income. But there was something missing. There was no section asking what Claire wanted. Then I saw the date. My hands stopped moving. The plan had been created 11 months before my father died. Mark hadn't made a bad decision because grief had temporarily affected him. He had been planning around my father's death while Dad was still alive, while Dad was still driving to the hardware store, while he was still calling me every Sunday, while I was still assuming my husband was simply tired of his job. 11 months earlier, Mark had already created a financial blueprint for a future funded by my father's estate. And that was the moment I understood why Dad had built the trust. He hadn't been trying to control me. He had been buying me time to see what I might otherwise excuse. I did confront Mark immediately. Instead, I watched. Over the next few days, his plans began collapsing one by one. The realtor emailed me about the lake property. Diane called because she had already told her landlord she probably wouldn't renew her lease. Melissa called asking when the estate money would become available because Mark had advised her not to agree to a long repayment plan with her creditors. Suddenly, I wasn't just dealing with my husband's expectations. His promises had created expectations in other people's lives, and somehow I was supposed to fix them. When I told Mark that his family had started making financial decisions based on money they didn't have, he simply said, "We'll sort it out." I looked directly at him and said, "You don't understand. You didn't just spend my inheritance. You spent my ability to say no." That sentence changed the conversation. Mark became angry. He accused me of turning my father's death into a battle over money. I told him the truth. Money wasn't the real problem. The problem was that he had made decisions for me and assumed I would eventually surrender because that was what I had done throughout our marriage. He didn't answer. Instead, he left the room. Later that week, he called his former employer and asked whether his old position might still be available. It was. The company had already offered it to someone else. I watched him sit at the kitchen table after that call, staring at his hands. For the first time, he looked less like an arrogant husband who expected an inheritance and more like a man realizing that the future he had built in his head had never actually existed. A few days later, I heard him talking to Melissa on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I was folding laundry in the next room. Melissa was upset because Mark had told her the money wouldn't be coming. He kept apologizing. Then I heard him say, "No, you need to work something out with your creditors. I know what I promised you, but it wasn't mine to promise." I froze. A few minutes later, he called his mother and told her not to give notice on her apartment. Deanne was angry. She reminded him that he had promised to buy her a home. Mark didn't argue. He simply said, "I know, I was wrong. I promised you something that wasn't mine." It was the first time since Dad died that I saw genuine accountability from him, and strangely, it made everything harder. That Sunday, I asked Mark to sit with me at the kitchen table. I placed the investment plan between us. He looked at it and immediately knew what it was. I asked him why he had created it 11 months before my father died. He said he had been tired. I asked why he had listed every financial benefit my inheritance could provide but never once written down what I wanted. He didn't have an answer. Finally, he admitted something I'd never expected to hear. He said he had spent years watching my father succeed, retire early, and have the freedom to help his family. Mark wanted to feel like that. He wanted to be the person who could fix everyone's problems. He wanted his mother to stop worrying about rent. He wanted his sister free from debt. He wanted to stop working. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that my inheritance was the solution to all of those things. Then he looked at me and said, "I wanted to become the kind of man your father was." I answered quietly, "You were trying to become that man with my money." He lowered his eyes. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I finally realized that Mark hadn't necessarily spent those 11 months plotting to steal from me. His failure was more ordinary and in some ways more painful. He had created a story in his mind where my inheritance solved every disappointment he had ever had about his own life. And in that story, I wasn't a person making decisions. I was the account that made his plans possible. My daughter Emily eventually found out about the investment plan. She read it silently at our kitchen table. When she reached the date, she looked at her father and asked, "You made this while Grandpa was still alive?" Mark nodded. She didn't yell. She didn't insult him. She simply said, "Dad, you didn't even wait for Mom to know what she wanted." Mark looked down. Emily turned toward me and apologized for previously asking why I was making such a big deal about the money. She said she hadn't understood. I told her she didn't need to take sides. This wasn't about choosing between her parents. It was about recognizing that marriage did not mean one person automatically became the decision maker for the other. That night, Mark came into our bedroom and said we couldn't keep living like strangers. I agreed. Then he said something I will never forget. If we're married, we should build our future together. I looked at him and answered, I agree, but building a future together means both people get to choose it. I reminded him that he had quit his job without asking me. He had promised his mother a house without asking me. He had promised his sister $200,000 without asking me. He had designed a retirement plan around my father's death without asking me. Then I asked him the simplest question of all. Why am I the one who has to prove that I'm committed to this marriage? He had no answer. That was when I moved into the guest room, not because I had decided to divorce him. I hadn't. I moved because I needed one room in my own house where nobody expected me to compromise. Mark eventually moved into the guest room too, and within weeks the house became strangely polite. We asked each other whether the dog had been fed. We discussed groceries. We talked about work, but the marriage itself was suspended in the air between us. Mark eventually found another sales position. It paid less and required more travel, but he accepted it. He canceled the lake property. He stopped asking about the trust. He told his mother she would have to stay in her apartment. He told Melissa she would need to work through her debts. None of those things destroyed his family. They simply returned everyone to the ordinary reality they had lived in before my father's death. Several months passed. Mark and I began counseling separately, and eventually we attended a few sessions together. During one session, our counselor asked Mark why he had been so certain I would eventually agree to everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because she always comes around." I looked at him. That sentence hurt more than the investment plan, because he was right. For 22 years, I had called it compromise when sometimes it was simply surrender. I had thought keeping the peace made me a good wife. I had confused avoiding conflict with having a healthy marriage. Mark had learned that if he pushed long enough, I would eventually make the discomfort disappear by giving him what he wanted. Eventually, I asked Mark to move out permanently. There was no screaming, no dramatic scene. He rented a small apartment 15 minutes away. He made several trips for his clothes and belongings. On the final trip, he stood in our kitchen holding his keys and looked around as though he were trying to memorize the room. We had lived there for years. We had raised our daughter there. We had celebrated birthdays, survived arguments, hosted Thanksgiving, and planned vacations in that kitchen. 22 years of marriage didn't disappear because one person crossed a financial boundary. I still loved parts of him. I still missed his laugh. I even missed his ridiculous habit of leaving cabinet doors open. But missing someone isn't proof that you should return to them. The divorce process took months. It wasn't vicious, but it wasn't easy either. Mark continued working. Diane stayed in her apartment. Melissa found a full-time job and started paying down her debts herself. Nobody ended up homeless. Nobody's life collapsed. The disaster everyone had predicted if I refused to release my inheritance never happened. That taught me something important. Sometimes people call your boundary cruel because your boundary prevents them from benefiting from your generosity. That doesn't mean the boundary is cruel. I handled my father's inheritance differently than Mark had imagined. I didn't buy a lake house. I didn't quit my job. I didn't suddenly start living like a celebrity. I worked with Samuel and a financial advisor. I kept most of the money invested. I strengthened my retirement plan. I created an education fund for future grandchildren. I also donated money to a community college scholarship program my father had quietly supported for years. And when I eventually helped Emily with a down payment, I did something that felt strangely powerful. I sat down with her first. We discussed the amount, the reason, and whether there were any expectations attached. There weren't. It was my choice, her choice, nobody else's. The final divorce documents were signed almost a year after my father died. Mark and I met for coffee afterward. 22 years doesn't disappear just because lawyers put signatures on paper. We talked about ordinary things. His job, Emily, Deanne, the dog. Eventually, Mark looked down at his coffee and said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd never quit?" I thought about it. "Maybe we'd still be married," I said. He nodded. Then I added, but the problem would probably still be there. He asked what I meant. I told him, you believed being my husband meant you had ownership over things that belonged to me. The inheritance didn't create that problem. It just made the problem impossible for me to ignore. Mark didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, I wish I'd understood that sooner. I told him I wished I had too. Then we hugged in the parking lot and went our separate ways. There was sadness in it, but there was also something else. Relief. Not because my marriage had failed. Not because Mark had suffered consequences. Relief because I finally understood that I was allowed to make a decision without first making sure everyone else was comfortable with it. For a long time, I thought my father's final gift to me was the money. It was. The money helped, certainly. But the real gift was the time he built into the trust. He didn't tell me to leave Mark. He didn't tell me Mark was a bad man. He didn't take control of my marriage. He simply recognized that I might be vulnerable during grief and protected my ability to make decisions slowly. Without that protection, I know exactly what might have happened. Mark would have apologized. Diane would have cried. Melissa would have explained how badly she needed the money. Everyone would have reminded me that we were family. And eventually, I probably would have said yes just to make the conflict disappear. 3 days after my father died, my husband quit his job because he believed my inheritance meant neither of us would ever have to worry about money again. He was wrong. Mark went back to work. My mother-in-law stayed in her apartment. My sister-in-law paid her own debts. And I learned something I should have understood 22 years earlier. Peace and respect are not the same thing. Peace can mean nobody is arguing. Respect means everybody gets a voice. My father left me $3.8 million, but that wasn't the most valuable thing he left behind. He left me enough time to finally see myself clearly. I had spent years smoothing over arguments, swallowing disappointment, and calling it love. I had spent so long protecting everyone else's comfort that I forgot I was allowed to protect my own. Dad's trust didn't tell me what decision to make. It simply made sure nobody else could make it for me. And maybe that's what inheritance really means sometimes. Not money, not houses, not investments. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is the courage to stop repeating the same pattern that hurt you. I didn't inherit my father's business. I didn't inherit his truck or his stubbornness or his 4 ridiculous tape measures. I inherited something quieter. The ability to stand in my own life and finally say, this decision belongs to me. This is Twisted Family Tales, where the deepest family betrayals aren't always the loudest ones, and where sometimes the person everyone expects to keep the peace is finally the person who decides to stop paying for it. If this story made you think about the difference between love, sacrifice, and respect, tell me in the comments. Would you have stayed and tried to rebuild the marriage, or would Mark's 11-month financial plan have changed everything for you?